Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Or perhaps, if it's late where you are, welcome to a quiet corner of the internet where we can dim the lights, perhaps grab a warm beverage, and just settle in. Tonight we're going to gently drift through a topic that might seem a bit niche, a bit specific, but it's one that often pops into people's heads when they picture historical indigenous life in North America. How on earth did Native Americans sleep in tents without just, freezing to death? It's a fair question, isn't it? We tend to imagine these rather flimsy-looking structures, tipis, wigwams, whatever image springs to mind, and then juxtapose that with a harsh winter landscape, perhaps a blanket of snow, and we think, nope, not gonna work. Our modern brains, accustomed to central heating and double-pane windows, struggle with the concept of surviving winter with what looks to us like glorified camping gear. But of course, as with most things in history, the reality is far more nuanced and, frankly, a lot more ingenious than our initial assumptions. It wasn't just a matter of toughing it out, although resilience was certainly a factor. It was about sophisticated design, material knowledge, and a deep understanding of the environment. Let's start by gently pushing aside that rather generalized image of a tent. Because, much like saying a house, it doesn't really tell you much, does it? A suburban ranch house is quite different from a grand Victorian mansion, and both are entirely distinct from a simple cabin. Similarly, the structures used by various Native American tribes across the vast North American continent were incredibly diverse, each tailored to specific climates, available resources, and cultural practices. You had tipis, yes, but also wigwams, longhouses, earth lodges, hogans, chickees, and a whole host of other fascinating designs. And each one had its own particular strategies for keeping its occupants from becoming human icicles. So when we talk about tents, we're often defaulting to the most iconic image, the teepee. And for good reason. It's a brilliant piece of engineering, particularly for the nomadic plains tribes. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we dive into the specific architectural wonders, let's just generally consider the concept of a shelter in a cold environment. What do you need? You need insulation, you need to block the wind, and ideally, you need a way to generate and retain heat. Pretty basic, right? But the execution? Oh, the execution is where the magic happens. Take, for instance, the materials. When we think of tents today, we think of lightweight nylon or canvas. Not exactly known for their insulating properties, are they? But traditional indigenous shelters often utilized materials that were far more effective. Animal hides, for example, were a staple. Think buffalo, deer, elk. These animals evolved to survive harsh winters themselves, and their skins, when properly processed, retain a good deal of their insulating qualities. Multiple layers of hides could be used, creating air pockets that further enhanced insulation. It's the same principle as wearing layers of clothing. Trapped air is a fantastic insulator. Beyond hides, there were other natural materials: bark, reeds, woven mats, even earth and sod. Each of these, depending on the region, offered different advantages in terms of insulation, wind resistance, and thermal mass. It wasn't about finding one perfect material, it was about intelligently utilizing what was locally abundant and best suited for the specific climate challenges. Now let's gently meander our way into the specifics of the teepee, as it's such a quintessential image. The conical shape itself is a marvel. It's inherently stable against strong winds, and it's surprisingly efficient for heating. Imagine trying to heat a rectangular box. You get cold corners, heat rising and getting trapped uselessly at the ceiling. A cone, however, encourages a natural convection current. Heat rises, circulates, and then gently descends, providing a more even distribution of warmth throughout the living space. It's like a natural, slow-moving heat circulation system. The construction of a teepee wasn't just throwing some hides over a few poles. Oh no, it was a carefully designed system. You typically had a framework of strong wooden poles, often lodgepole pine, which are naturally straight and resilient.
Over this framework, multiple layers of coverings would be applied. Often, there would be an inner liner, sometimes made of canvas or tanned hides, extending partway up the interior walls. This inner liner served several crucial purposes. Firstly, it created an insulation airspace between the inner and outer coverings, acting like a primitive form of double glazing, but for your entire dwelling. Secondly, it prevented drafts from entering at ground level, effectively sealing off the lower portion of the teepee from biting winds. And thirdly, it channeled smoke more efficiently. Ah yes, smoke. Because how do you generate heat in a cold environment? You build a fire, of course. And this is where the teepee truly shines as a cold weather dwelling. Unlike our modern tents, which are usually a strict no open flames inside zone, the teepee was designed to accommodate a central fire pit. The smoke flaps at the top of the teepee were adjustable, allowing the occupants to control the draw and ventilation. The inner liner, by directing the smoke upwards, helped prevent the interior from becoming a suffocating smokehouse. The conical shape further aided this, as smoke naturally rises and funnels out through the top opening. Now you might be thinking, but wouldn't some heat just escape through that smoke hole? And yes, of course, some did. It's not a hermetically sealed unit, but the goal wasn't to achieve sauna-like temperatures. It was to create a comfortable, livable internal environment, often significantly warmer than the frigid outside air, without wasting precious fuel. And a small, well-managed fire, burning wood efficiently, could provide a remarkable amount of warmth, especially when combined with all those insulating layers. Let's not forget the ground itself. The floor of a teepee wasn't just bare earth. It was often covered with layers of insulating materials. Furs, woven mats, dried grasses, all these would be laid down to create a barrier between the cold ground and the sleeping occupants. Think of it like a very thick natural rug. And on top of that, people would have their bedding, which often consisted of buffalo robes or other animal furs, providing even more warmth. Sleeping directly on the cold earth is a surefire way to lose body heat, so elevating and insulating the sleeping area was a fundamental strategy. Another often overlooked aspect of staying warm in these structures was the communal element. These structures were not typically single-person dwellings. Families and sometimes extended families would share a single teepee. More bodies mean more body heat, which is a simple but effective way to warm up a space. Huddling together, sharing blankets and robes, it all contributed to a warmer interior climate. It's a bit like a group hug, but for survival. And speaking of living within the space, the daily activities themselves contributed to warmth. Cooking over the fire, the movement of people, all these generated a bit of residual heat. It wasn't just a passive structure, it was an active living environment where the occupants' very presence helped maintain a comfortable temperature. Let's gently float over to another type of dwelling, one less associated with the open plains and more with forested areas, the wigwam. Now the term wigwam is a bit like teepee. It's an Algonquian word that refers to various dome-shaped or conical structures. But generally, when people picture a wigwam, they're thinking of a rounded, often bark-covered dwelling. These were common among tribes in the Northeast and Great Lakes regions, where timber and bark were abundant resources.
Unlike the teepee's relatively quick assembly and disassembly for nomadic life, wigwams were often more semi-permanent. They still offered portability, as the framework could often be left in place and simply recovered, but they were generally sturdier and designed for longer-term occupancy in a particular location. The construction usually involved a framework of bent saplings or poles, forming a dome or a more elongated oval shape. These poles would be lashed together, creating a strong, flexible skeleton, and then the covering. This is where the insulation really came into play. Layers of bark, often birch bark, which is incredibly waterproof and durable, would be shingled over the frame. Beneath the bark, or sometimes woven into the inner layers, you might find reed mats, woven cattail mats, or even animal hides. Again, the principle is the same: multiple layers, trapping air, creating a robust barrier against the elements. A central fire pit was also common in wigwams, with a smoke hole at the apex of the dome. The design, while different from a teepee, still allowed for efficient smoke ventilation and heat retention. The rounded shape minimizes the surface area exposed to the cold, which is a smart way to reduce heat loss. It's like how an igloo works. A dome is structurally sound and thermally efficient. The floor of a wigwam would also be carefully prepared. Raised sleeping platforms, often covered with furs or mats, would keep people off the cold ground. Storage pits might be dug inside, keeping food and supplies cool in summer and protected in winter. These were not just shelters, they were homes, thoughtfully designed to meet the needs of their inhabitants in all seasons. Now let's consider something even more robust, something that really takes the concept of insulation to the next level, the earth lodge. These were common among tribes like the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara of the plains, particularly along river valleys where they engaged in settled agriculture. When you think earth lodge, you should be picturing something incredibly substantial, almost like a hobbit hole, but on a grander scale. An earth lodge was essentially a large circular dwelling built around a strong wooden framework, but the key element, the star of the show for winter warmth, was the earth itself. The entire structure, or at least the walls and roof, would be covered with thick layers of sod and earth. We're talking feet of earth sometimes. What does this do? Well, earth is an incredible insulator. It has high thermal mass, meaning it absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. In winter, this meant the earth lodge stayed remarkably warm even when temperatures plummeted outside. The earth acted as a giant thermal battery, moderating the internal temperature. Imagine a really cold night. The fire is burning in the center of the earth lodge, its smoke gently curling out through a smoke hole at the top. The thick earth walls prevent heat from escaping quickly, and they also block out any wind or drafts. The ground inside would be prepared with furs and mats, and multiple families might share the large space. It was a cozy, well-insulated haven against the harshest prairie winters. During the summer, the thermal mass of the earth worked in reverse, keeping the interior cool and comfortable even when it was scorching outside. It's a brilliant example of passive heating and cooling, developed long before anyone thought of air conditioning. And then there were the longhouses, particularly prominent among the Iroquois and other northeastern tribes. These were truly impressive structures, often dozens of feet long, designed to house multiple related families under one roof. Imagine a sort of communal apartment building, but made of wood and bark. A longhouse consisted of a sturdy timber frame, often made of bent poles, covered with overlapping layers of elm or birch bark. The sheer size of these structures and the communal living within them contributed to their warmth. Multiple fire pits would be spaced along the central aisle, each serving a few families. The smoke would rise and exit through openings in the roof. The bark covering, combined with an inner lining of mats or skins, provided good insulation. The communal aspect of longhouse living was key for warmth. Imagine dozens of people, all contributing body heat, all sharing fires. It created a miniature ecosystem of warmth within the longhouse, a stark contrast to the cold outside. It was a testament to the power of community, not just for social cohesion, but for physical survival. Let's not forget the ingenuity of the sleeping arrangements themselves. It wasn't just about the structure, it was about how people actually slept. As mentioned before, animal furs were absolutely essential. Buffalo robes, bear skins, deer hides. These were not just floor coverings, they were blankets, mattresses, and an integral part of staying warm. They are incredibly warm, naturally water-resistant to a degree, and durable. People also understood the importance of layering clothing, even while sleeping. While we might strip down to pajamas, indigenous people often slept in their warm daytime clothing or added additional layers. Blankets made from woven plant fibers or fur, combined with robes, created multiple layers of insulation. And what about body positioning? Curling up, snuggling with others, keeping extremities tucked in, these are natural human instincts for staying warm, and they certainly were utilized. Sometimes hot stones would be placed near sleeping areas, or a small, carefully managed fire would be kept burning very low through the night, providing just enough radiant heat to take the edge off the cold. It's also important to remember that people were acclimated to their environment. This isn't to say they didn't feel the cold, but generations of living in a particular climate fosters a certain resilience and understanding of how to cope. Their bodies were accustomed to the natural rhythms of hot and cold, and their daily routines were often structured around mitigating environmental challenges. For example, winter was a time for certain activities that could be done indoors, like storytelling, crafting, and repairing tools. During these activities, people would be gathered around fires, generating and sharing warmth. Their diet also played a role. Consuming high-fat, high-protein foods provided the necessary energy to fuel their internal furnaces and maintain body temperature. So when we ask, how did Native Americans sleep in tents without freezing to death? The answer isn't a single simple trick. It's a complex, multifaceted approach involving sophisticated architectural design, expert knowledge of natural materials, intelligent use of fire, communal living practices, and a deep understanding of human physiology and environmental adaptation. It was a holistic system, refined over millennia, that allowed people to thrive in incredibly challenging conditions. It really puts our modern camping experiences into perspective, doesn't it? We bundle up in high-tech sleeping bags, huddle in synthetic tents, and still sometimes shiver. Imagine the skill and knowledge required to construct a shelter from scratch, using only natural materials that could withstand a blizzard and keep a family warm through the night. It's truly remarkable.
Let's take a brief moment to consider some of the myths and misconceptions surrounding this topic. One common idea is that indigenous people simply had a higher tolerance for cold, almost as if they were genetically different. While there's certainly an element of acclimation, as mentioned, it's not about some inherent superpower that made them immune to freezing. They felt the cold just like anyone else, but they had incredibly effective strategies for dealing with it. Their survival wasn't due to some biological anomaly. It was due to ingenuity, knowledge, and hard work. Another misconception is that these structures were primitive or unsophisticated. Nothing could be further from the truth. The engineering principles behind a well-constructed teepee or earth lodge are incredibly advanced. They demonstrate a deep understanding of physics, thermodynamics, and material science, even if those concepts weren't formally articulated in academic terms. It was knowledge gained through observation, experimentation, and generations of passed-down wisdom. It was applied science, honed in the crucible of survival. Imagine the skill involved in tanning hides to make them soft, pliable, and insulating, yet durable enough to withstand the elements. Or the knowledge required to select the right types of wood for a sturdy frame, or the perfect bark for a waterproof covering. These were complex crafts requiring years of learning and practice. The seasonal cycles also dictated how people lived and where they built their shelters. In many regions, tribes would move between different types of dwellings depending on the time of year. For example, some plains tribes might use easily transportable teepees during hunting seasons, but then settle into more permanent, insulated earth lodges for the harsh winter months. This adaptability was another key to survival. They weren't just stuck with one type of tent, they had a whole toolkit of housing solutions. Consider the Arctic regions, where temperatures could be truly brutal. Here you find the famous igloo. While not a tent in the traditional sense, it perfectly illustrates the principles of insulation and thermal mass. An igloo made of compacted snow works because snow itself is a fantastic insulator. The air pockets trapped within the snow blocks create a highly effective barrier against the outside cold. And the dome shape, again, is structurally sound and efficient for heat retention. A small oil lamp, or even just body heat, can raise the internal temperature of an igloo significantly above freezing, creating a surprisingly comfortable living space. So, from the plains to the forests, from the river valleys to the Arctic, the indigenous peoples of North America developed a vast array of sophisticated housing solutions to combat the cold. These weren't just random, hastily erected shelters. They were carefully designed, expertly crafted homes born from an intimate understanding of their environment and a deep-seated desire to survive and thrive. And this leads us back to our original question, gently reminding us that history is rarely as simple as our modern biases might suggest. When we see an old photograph or an artist's rendition of a teepee in the snow, it's easy to project our own experiences and assume discomfort or even danger. But what we're actually seeing is the culmination of centuries of innovation, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of environmental challenges. It's a subtle reminder that primitive doesn't equate to ineffective. In fact, often the opposite is true. These so-called primitive technologies were perfectly adapted to their context, utilizing local resources in sustainable and incredibly efficient ways. They didn't have access to synthetic insulation or forced air heating, but they had something arguably more valuable: deep, practical knowledge of their world and how to work with it rather than against it. So the next time you picture a teepee standing proudly against a snowy backdrop, perhaps you'll see it not as a flimsy tent against the elements, but a warm, cozy home, a testament to clever design and resourceful living. It's a quiet history, one of survival and adaptation, built into the very fabric of these remarkable structures. And on that warm and cozy note, perhaps it's time for us to gently drift off to sleep. Thank you for joining me tonight, and I hope you found this little journey into historical warmth a soothing one. Until next time, stay curious and sleep well.
To understand the warmth, we have to talk about the buffalo robe. Now, in our modern world, we have weighted blankets and performance fleece, which are fine, I suppose, if you like synthetic fibers and polyester blends. But the Plains tribes had the original heavy-duty thermal solution. A buffalo grows a winter coat that is frankly overkill for most living things. It's thick, it's woolly, and it's designed to keep a several hundred-pound beast happy in a blizzard. When humans took that hide and tanned it, which was an exhausting multi-day process involving brains and elbow grease, because history is nothing if not labor-intensive, they ended up with a material that was essentially a biological spacesuit. When you slept, you didn't just have one of these, you were sandwiched. One robe, fur side up, on your sleeping platform to block the rising damp and cold from the ground, and another, fur side down, over your body. This created a microclimate. The fur trapped your body heat almost instantly. It was so effective that historical accounts from European traders often mention waking up inside a teepee feeling quite sweaty while the water bucket 5 feet away was frozen solid. Talk about an aggressive temperature gradient. And while we're on the subject of sleeping, let's talk about the social geography of the tent. If you were a royal in a European drafty castle, which we love to roast on this channel because honestly the architecture was a disaster, you slept in a giant, lonely bed in a room with 30-foot ceilings. Pure madness. In a teepee or a wigwam, you practiced what I like to call strategic snuggling.
It wasn't just about family bonding, it was a survival imperative. You had the kids, the grandparents, and the dogs all contributing to the ambient temperature. A medium-sized dog produces about the same amount of heat as a small radiator, and they don't require an outlet. It's a win-win, really, unless the dog has a snoring problem. But what about the wind? The Great Plains are essentially a giant wind tunnel. You can have the best fire in the world, but if the wind is cutting through your walls, you're done for. This is where the liner comes back into play, but with a snarky twist of engineering. The outer skin of the teepee usually didn't touch the ground perfectly. It left a gap for ventilation. Wait, you might say, isn't that a terrible idea for winter? Well, yes, if you stop there, but they didn't. They added an inner wall, a dew cloth, that fastened to the poles about 5 feet up and tucked under the floor mats. This created a chimney effect. The cold air came in under the outer skin, stayed behind the liner, and was sucked up toward the top by the heat of the fire. This meant the occupants stayed in a pocket of still, warm air, while the draft was used to fuel the fire and carry away the smoke. It's a level of fluid dynamics that most of us can't achieve with a modern kitchen vent, and they did it with sticks and leather. Because why not just outsmart the atmosphere while you're trying to have a nap? Let's float over to the northeast, where the Iroquois and Algonquian tribes were dealing with a different kind of cold, the damp, bone-chilling humidity of the deep woods. Here, the longhouse was the king of thermal management. Now, imagine a building made of bark that's 100 feet long. Inside, you have a central aisle with a row of fires. It's basically a very long, very smoky hallway. If you were a guest in a longhouse, you noticed the bunks. These weren't just for comfort, they were a tactical move. Heat rises. If you sleep on the floor, you're a victim. If you sleep on a platform raised 2 or 3 feet up, you're in the sweet spot of the thermal layer. Under these platforms, they stored firewood and dried corn. This acted as further insulation, a literal buffer of food and fuel between you and the frozen earth. It's like sleeping on top of your pantry, which honestly sounds like a dream come true for some of us. Of course, we can't talk about survival without mentioning the irony of the smoke hole. Many early European observers thought the hole in the top was a flaw. They'd see snow falling through it and think, how tragic, they're getting wet. But the fire in the center was usually hot enough that the snow would evaporate before it even hit the floor. Or if it was particularly nasty out, they had adjustable ears, large flaps of skin on the outside of the teepee controlled by long poles. You could move them based on the wind direction to keep the draft perfect and the interior dry. It was like having a manual leather-based thermostat. If the wind shifted at 2 a.m., someone, usually the person closest to the door because life is unfair, would have to step out and adjust the poles. A small price to pay for not suffocating or freezing, I suppose. Then there's the matter of clothing as architecture. When you're in these environments, the line between your house and your clothes gets a bit blurry. The brain-tan buckskin used for leggings and moccasins wasn't just fashion, it was windproof. And more importantly, they stuffed their moccasins with dried grass or buffalo hair. It's the 18th century version of high-tech insulation inserts. You didn't just walk on the ground, you walked on a portable cushion of trapped air. I think we also need to give a quick, sarcastic shout-out to the hearth culture. In a modern house, we hide our furnace in a basement or a closet because it's ugly and loud. In a traditional indigenous dwelling, the fire was the literal and metaphorical heart. It was a person. You fed it, you respected it, and in return, it kept you from becoming a statue. There was no turning up the heat. There was only the constant rhythmic task of keeping the fire alive. It created a different sense of time, a slow, meditative focus on the glow of the embers. Very ASMR if you ignore the occasional pop of sap in the wood. And what about the dark side of this? Not tragic, just dark. Winters were long. If you were stuck in an earth lodge for 3 weeks during a blizzard, you weren't just fighting the cold, you were fighting boredom. But that's why the oral traditions were so rich. You'd have the elders telling stories that lasted for days. The heat of the fire, the smell of drying herbs, the low murmur of a grandmother recounting the origins of the Milky Way, all of it created a sensory blanket that was just as important as the buffalo hides. It's easy for us to look back and pity them for not having electricity, but when you look at the design of a Hidsitsa earth lodge, where the walls are 3 feet thick with packed soil, and the interior is a spacious, cozy dome that smells like cedar and roasting meat, I don't know, it sounds a lot better than a drafty apartment with a broken radiator and a landlord who won't answer the phone. So, as we settle deeper into our own blankets, let's just appreciate that surviving wasn't a fluke. It was a masterpiece of human observation. They didn't just survive the winter, they owned it. They understood that you don't fight the cold with brute force, you outmaneuver it with layers, logic, and a little bit of communal body heat.